Hello friends! So today I wanted to talk to you about my favorite books of 2021. This is going to be broken up into a few categories and there's going to be quite a few books on here. So I have categorized them into nonfiction, graphic novels, fantasy, general fiction, and then my top 3 favorite books of the year. I'm going to start with nonfiction and then probably move my way into fantasy. So the first nonfiction that I'm going to talk about is actually one of the first nonfiction books that I read this year, and that is Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talaga. Tanya Talaga is an Indigenous journalist, and this nonfiction is following the story of 7 Indigenous students who went missing and then were subsequently found dead in Thunder Bay, Ontario. So the way that the story is structured is, in the beginning, it does talk about the history of residential schools and how residential schools are not a thing that is so far removed from our current day. I think, if I'm correct, the last residential school closed in 1996. So to say that residential schools were a part of our past is just not accurate. And so she gives that foundation to take you into this story of how the education system continues to be set up in a way to fail Indigenous students. It just reinforced the way that our education system and criminal justice system is not set up for specific groups of people. And I just felt so angry the whole time. That's the only way I can describe it, because in so many of these cases with these kids, they were only teenagers. Many of them were hundreds of miles away from their family and their home, and every single one of these cases have really weird and suspect circumstances surrounding the deaths. It's just a very frustrating read, but I think it's a very necessary read, especially if you don't know much about residential schools. I think it's a really great starting point because it gives you the foundation of residential schools and the history of residential schools, and then takes you into the repercussions of residential schools, and you can see those repercussions in your day-to-day life. So that's why I definitely think about this book a lot, because it made me look at our education system even more differently than I already did. I feel like I already have a very skewed perception of the education system, but this worsened it, I feel. And I hesitate to say like, oh, this is my favorite nonfiction, because it's not my favorite because I liked it. It's my favorite because I think it's one of those accessible nonfictions that is really important, especially if you're working on educating yourself and anti-racism work. I think this gives you a really great foundation and starting off point, and so I really appreciated this book for what it shows you and teaches you, and the groundwork that it lays for you, I guess. The next nonfiction book is a memoir, and that is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. So you may have seen my vlog where I talk about this. I don't think I finished it in that vlog, but one of the things that I was talking about was that this book just felt so personal to me, because while this is called a memoir, this is more about a slice of Michelle Zauner's life where her mother gets diagnosed with cancer. Michelle starts to take care of her and go through the motions of taking care of her mom and then losing her mom, and a lot of her grief is filled with food and like realizing that her mom and her love language was food. And so there's a lot of discussions about food in here and how she used food as a grieving mechanism to like get closer to her mom. But she also just talks about grief. And for me, this just felt so personal, because when I was 19, I lost my mom to cancer, and she had battled it for 3.5 years, and I was her caretaker. And so some of the things that Michelle says in here just felt like they came from my brain. I think within the first couple of paragraphs of this book, I was sobbing, because just some of the things that she talks about in regards to grief and anger with grief, and the fact that she similarly had a really strained relationship with her mother, the anger that comes along with that grief of wanting to fix a relationship that you no longer really have the opportunity to fix with that person, if that makes sense. And so I do feel like this could be a very triggering book, and I avoided it for a while, and then I just said fuck it, and I read it, and it was very cathartic in many ways but kind of traumatizing in other ways. So I do want to warn you that if you are somebody who has lost somebody recently, has lost somebody to cancer especially, maybe just go into it with a lot of care. Take care of yourself when you're reading it if you want to read it. I don't know. I just felt this one deep in my soul. It will forever be a favorite memoir, but I don't know that I will ever reread this just because of how traumatizing it was at times. And then the last nonfiction book is another memoir that I'm going to talk about that, oh my god. That's Heavy by Kiese Layman. When I tell you that I sobbed at many times through this book, but at the end of the book, and I had a witness to it because I was listening to this on audiobook. It's a relatively short memoir, and I think I was a half an hour from the end, and I was like cooking dinner and I was literally like chopping onions, just sobbing, and my partner comes in and is like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, I'm reading." I saw someone on Instagram talking about this, and I was like, you know what? I love a good memoir. I'm really in the mood for memoir right now, and it was available on Scribd, so I just started listening to it. I didn't know anything about Kiese Layman, didn't know much beyond the small review that the person had about Heavy. Ooh, yeah. So upon finishing it and sobbing like a baby, I did go out the next day and buy a copy, which I do want to reread this and annotate it. I have since bought everything by Kiese Layman. They have another nonfiction book and one full-length novel, which I'm really looking forward to reading. But anyway, this is a memoir about Kiese Layman, and the title is like a double entendre because he, on one hand, is talking about his struggle with his body and gaining and losing weight over the years, and it's also talking about the heavy burden of being a Black man in America. And while this is small, it packs a punch. I don't recommend reading it in one day like I did, but I couldn't put it down because I loved his writing, and I just thought he had an interesting way of talking about things. I mean, a lot of this book is about body image. It's about gaining and losing weight and the unhealthy and healthy relationships we have with our bodies and how that relationship is cultivated through other things. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect. It made me think about bodies in a very different way. Much like Hunger by Roxane Gay, it definitely made me view the world a lot differently when it comes to all types of bodies. But he also talks about being a Black man in higher education because he's a professor, and his recollections on being a professor in a primarily white school. And there's a really interesting section about performative activism. He actually gives an example of a time in his life and he was performative near the time of 9/11. And I thought that was really interesting because he was talking about how he was on a bus and somebody made a racist comment towards somebody that they perceived as Muslim, and he stood up for that person. And then when he left that bus, he was like, all right, my work here is done. And he was talking about how sometimes when we think we're performing an act of good faith, we then think like, well, our job here is done. I've done what I needed to do and I'm through with that. And it was just really interesting how he talked about it, and that part really stuck out to me. It's just so good. It's such an impactful read, and it's one that I'm definitely going to reread. I feel like I want to read it again at the beginning of this year since I read it at the beginning of last year, and this time I want to heavily annotate this. And I can't wait to read everything by Kiese Layman. So moving into my favorite graphic novels of the year, the first one I want to talk about is The Magic Fish. And this is a coming of age story about our main character Tien, who is first generation Vietnamese American, and his parents are struggling to learn English. So one of the ways that they communicate with one another is by reading to each other, especially his mom and him. And so his mom and him typically read each other fairy tales, and Tien is coming to learn that he is gay, and he has a crush on one of his friends, and he wants to tell his mom about it, but he doesn't think that his mom is going to accept him. So he tries to use fairy tales in a way to communicate this part of his life and who he is to his mom in hopes that she'll accept him. And this is such a beautiful, beautiful book. It's another book that made me cry. I think that's a theme, is that if it makes me cry, it's probably gonna be a favorite. One One of the things I really loved is that this book goes back and forth between fairy tales and the actual storyline. So you get these really interesting fairy tales, and then you go back to Tien's life and you get to see him with his crush and with his parents, and his mom and him have such a beautiful relationship. And I loved it. I don't have many words for this book because it just hit me at the right time, and it's one that I feel like I'll go back to time and time again. Also, I think this is a really powerful story about language and communication and being first generation, but also being an immigrant in America especially, and like the struggles that come with that. One of the other things is that this has some of the most beautiful illustrations, but not only that, I just love the coloring. And I'm a huge sucker for really beautiful artwork in graphic novels, and I definitely will pick this up when I need a pick-me-up because I feel like it's like a comfort read now. The next one is very similar to being a comfort read, and that's On a Sunbeam. This is another graphic novel that has a beautiful coloring and illustrations. So On a Sunbeam follows a few characters, but our main character is Mia, and Mia's storyline goes between the past and the present. In the present, she is working on this cruise ship where they go to different planets and like fix things on those planets, and then they just move on to the next project. But you find out in Mia's past that she was going to this school and fell in love, and that person that she fell in love with ended up getting separated from her, and she kind of didn't know what to do with her life after that except try to find her again. It's led her to this crew, so you go back and forth between the present timeline while she's on the crew and in the past when they meet and they fall in love. And it's the most beautiful sapphic love story, but it's also just a beautiful found family. So I feel like if you are somebody who likes The Long Way to a Small Hungry Planet and you love the found family trope, this is gonna be the book for you because it just hit all those marks for me. While it is sci-fi, it's definitely on the lighter side. It's more about the people in this story and the found family in this story and the love story. I'm not a romance person, but you give me a sapphic romance and I'm this is just really fun and heartwarming, and again, I feel like this is going to be a comfort read for me in the future because I'm for sure going to turn to this whenever I need a comfort read. Moving into general fiction, I have a few. The first one is Birdie. So basically you have a Cree woman named Bernice, and she has had something happen to her that you as the reader are unsure of what happened, and she decides that she wants to spend the rest of her life in a dream. So she goes to sleep and she starts having dreams. Throughout those dreams, you start to kind of unweave what happened to her and what brought her to this point. But you also start to learn about the really strong and beautiful relationships that she has with the women in her life and how those women come to save her. I can't really explain the love that I have for this story. It's a combination of the storytelling itself. I really liked the way that the story was told, and the fact that it was told through dreams and also other characters' perspectives, and it interweaves the past and the present. And at times you're on this wild ride where you don't exactly know what's happening, but the one thing that you can be sure of is the relationships that these women have with one another and how they continuously save one another. And that's the aspect besides the storytelling that I just loved the most, was the relationships in here, because I genuinely felt like these women were my friends. I felt like I could walk down the street and see them and say hi to them and hang out with them. They were written so realistically. There was just something about this novel that it's hard for me to not think about it. I think about it quite often, and it's funny because I think I gave this a 4 stars originally, but I've thought about it so often since finishing it that I can't imagine it being less than a 5 stars, because these characters stuck with me, the story stuck with me, and the writing style was just incredible. I don't think that this is a book for everybody. It really depends on how you like structure in your stories and if you're okay with, you know, a lack of traditional structure in a story. I absolutely think that this is worth the ride if you're willing to you know, stick with it and not care too much or read too much into the structure of the story and just let the story take you on the journey that it wants to take you on. I think all of these books, it's safe to say that I would reread most all of them. Crying in H Mart, I don't know, but all the other ones, I think so. The next book is Moon of the Crusted Snow. So Moon of the Crusted Snow falls into like a horror slash apocalyptic type story, and I don't want to say too much about what it is. So this is about a small northern Anishinaabe community, and there's this wild snowstorm that ends up cutting them off from basically all resources. So as they're cut off from these resources, they're kind of trying to scramble and figure out how they're going to preserve the limited amount of resources that they currently have and how they possibly could get more. In the beginning of the story, there's a man who comes into their community and things start to get weird and go downhill. That's all I want to say about like the plot. All I can tell you is this is definitely a slow burn, but if you like really insular, slow build, eerie, just having you kind of feel creeped out the entire time, but it's not necessarily always like jump scares or wild things happening, I think this is the perfect story for you. I love a slow build story where I don't know exactly where it's going, and the ending I feel like really pays off, especially because a lot of the things that happen here feel realistic. It doesn't feel out of the realm of possibility, and that's what makes this story creepier. That's all I can really say about it. It's another story I think about a lot, and I would love to reread it because I read it so fast the first time, just wanting to get to the end to know what was going to happen, that I'm sure I missed a lot of even creepier things. The next book on this list is Future Home of the Living God, and I've had this on my shelf for such a long time, and I finally decided to pick it up, and boy, did I love it. So one of the things about me is I really do like dystopian, but I like dystopian when it's like speculative fiction, and I'm not sure if maybe dystopian is like a speculative fiction, but I don't always feel that way about certain dystopian books. I don't know. The best example I can give you is like Parable of the Sower is one of my favorite dystopian slash speculative fiction books. I love that book. I actually reread it this year. I just didn't want to put that on my favorites list, but it's one of my favorite books, and I reread it, and reading Future Home of the Living God gave me those vibes. They're very different books in the sense that like what they're trying to accomplish is different, but structurally there's a lot of similarities, but I'm not comparing them by any means. I just, if you were ever curious about the type of dystopian slash speculative fiction that I like, it's these types of books. So Future Home of the Living God was just perfect for me. So Cedar, our main character, is adopted, and when she finds out that she's 4 months pregnant, she's like 26 by this time, and when she finds out that she's 4 months pregnant, she is determined to find her real parents. So she ends up finding her mother, Mary Potts, who is an Ojibwe woman, just so that she can understand where she came from and her origins. And this is something that's really important to what's happening slash unfolding in this story. So I'm not really going to give that away because at the beginning of the book, you as the reader don't really know what's happening, but you know something weird is going on. And there's this swelling panic within society and humanity that you start to slowly see unfolding, and you see it when she's writing diary entries and she kind of gives like a sidebar to something that happened on the news. And you start to come to this realization that something's off. And it was so good. Again, this is not a book that I think is for everybody. I definitely think if you're a fan of something like Parable of the Sower, you might really like this. I think much like Birdie, the writing isn't going to be for everybody, especially because it's not set up in a structural format like a normal book, because it is those diary entries. But it also kind of doesn't always make sense because you're not always clued into what's going on, because Cedar doesn't know what's going on. So you as a reader get to find it out with Cedar. And I just loved it. I ate it up. I thought it was so, it was just a ride. It was a wild ride. And I just love the topics that it's touching on. I think that's one of the things with all of these books that, you know, I fail to say a lot of the time is a lot of what I like in these books are like the topics that they're touching on or the commentary that they're trying to make. And it's just hard to say that because it might give things away. So sometimes I hesitate to give that part of the book away, but like there's a lot of commentary in most of these books that I just found to be really interesting and well done. And this book is no different. And actually the next book is no different. I guess I have a theme. But that's The Firekeeper's Daughter. I got an early audiobook of this and I read it in 2 days, and then I got the physical copy and I physically read it. So I really liked this book. This is a mystery. It's almost like a detective mystery, because our main character Donis kind of has to play into being a detective slash undercover with these other undercover cops because she witnessed a murder. So she's sucked into this investigation where they think that somebody is bringing drugs into the Ojibwe reservation. So as Donis goes undercover to kind of investigate where these drugs are coming from, who is bringing them onto the reservation, and how they can possibly stop this from happening, she starts to uncover a lot about her community, and it's devastating at times, but I just really loved our main character, and I loved how unapologetically Anishinaabe this was. Like, it didn't try to hold your hand through a lot of things that Donis was talking about when it came to cultural aspects, and it talks a lot about her struggle of being mixed race, because I believe it's her father was white and her mother is Anishinaabe, and so it's just really interesting to hear her everyday life, but also this mystery was really interesting as well. The only thing I will ever complain about with this book is that there is like a romance aspect that I didn't really care for, but I've come to expect that with YA. But the thing is the fact that this is YA and it worked so well for me when most YA like thrillers slash mysteries don't usually work for me says a lot as well. And I definitely felt like Donis was a teenager. This definitely didn't feel like Donis was somebody who was written as like a 20-something-year-old and then aged down to fit into YA. She just felt genuinely like a teenager, and I really, really loved this book. Obviously, I've read it twice already. But yeah, I loved this one. Well, my battery died in the middle of me filming yesterday, so I'm gonna just finish it today. I'm not even gonna try to refilm it. I'm just gonna finish it today. So now we're gonna move into my favorite fantasy books of the year. The first one that I want to talk about, it's actually a duology. I am not picking favorites in series this year. I'm not playing around. I'm not picking favorites. I loved both of these. I had a really good time. I also think because I read them back to back, they're kind of like one entity to me. And that's We Hunt the Flame and We Free the Stars. So obviously I can't talk about We Free the Stars, so we'll just focus on We Hunt the Flame. So We Hunt the Flame follows two POVs. The first POV is a huntress named Zafira, and she basically hunts for her town because otherwise they would kind of starve. And then you have our second perspective, who is Nasir, and Nasir is basically an assassin for the Sultan, and he is on this journey to basically assassinate somebody, and his paths cross with Zafira, and a whole journey ensues. So the one thing about this series is that it's a slow burn, although arguably the second book picks up its pace much more than We Hunt the Flame. The second one is almost at breakneck speed when you compare it to how slow We Hunt the Flame is. But as I've discovered over the last couple of years, I am very much a character-driven reader, and I love the dynamics between characters, and I'm totally cool if the plot is just like subpar, but the character development and the found family and the relationships are really well established. And that's what I felt in We Hunt the Flame. I really loved the found family aspect in here, especially because they were an unlikely found family, and a lot of the characters that you're introduced to in here are really, really interesting. I also loved the world building. Especially for a duology, I think it's really important to do the world building well and give the reader enough of the world, because if you kind of info dump it in the first one, it can be overwhelming. And I do think that like We Hunt the Flame and We Free the Stars are not perfect books. They're just really fun for me. They're fun. And actually my favorite character is Altair, who is more prevalent in the second book than the first one, meaning that he just gets his own POV in the second book, which made the second book even better. But again, I don't have a favorite of the two, but I was actually really surprised at how much fun I had with this series and the fact that I read it back to back. I actually haven't read a series back to back in a long time. I used to do that all the time. That used to be my thing. Anytime I started a series, I would force myself to finish that series if possible right away. As a matter of fact, I used to not even start new series unless it was completely published. Obviously, I don't do that now. But you know, I miss the old me. So anyway, I had a lot of fun with this one, and it was also one of those books that could probably go on my most surprising books because I've tried to read this a few years ago and didn't like it. But the reason, and this is something I'll advise to you as a reader, the audiobook is not great. It's like the narrators didn't get the names correct and they dubbed over some of the incorrect pronunciations of the names. So there's like really weird parts in it that sound off first, and then there is still like mispronunciations of things, which is interesting because I really like the Ember in the Ashes audiobooks and it's the same narrators, but this one just wasn't that great, so I don't advise it if you have other means of consuming this book. The next fantasy that I want to talk about is Upon a Burning Throne. This is also a very surprising read for me because I've had it on my shelves for a while, and before that I had it on my TBR for a while, and I finally broke down and bought the book and I read it and I loved it. I also buddy read this with Casey and Rachel, which made the reading experience even better because we were screaming in the chat about things going on in this book because this book is wild. Like, it does so much. It does so much. So this is a retelling of the Mahabharata, and it was originally supposed to be like a 9-book series, and now it's going to be a 3, which scares me because you're going from a 9-book idea to a 3-book idea. I don't know how. But basically, in the beginning of this book, the emperor of the Burning Empire has died, and now they need to declare a new emperor. And the way that they declare an emperor is they put a baby on the burning throne, and if the baby can survive the burning throne, then they are declared worthy enough to rule the burning empire. Obviously, if they don't, they're not. And 2 brothers, Shvat and Adri, actually pass the test, but because one brother is blind and one brother is albino, they do not believe that they on their own can rule this empire, so they want them to rule the empire together. But a little girl who is the daughter of Jarsun actually passes the test as well, but because of who her father is, they will not let her rule the empire. So Audrey and Shvat are the emperors, and you see them going through the motions of kind of growing up and learning how to be emperors, and then eventually coming into their own as young men. And there's like a brewing war in the background. There's a lot of conflict and drama. There's a lot of people who don't believe that they're worthy enough to be the emperors and don't understand why they needed 2 emperors to run their kingdom. So there's a lot of adversity that they're facing just within people not thinking they're worthy enough to run this empire, but there's a lot of happening in the background as well. One of the things that I loved about this book is how fast-paced it is. It is like breakneck speed, fast-paced. There's always something going on. But I also love that you get so many perspectives. I'm not always a fan of a million perspectives, I will admit. Sometimes it's really hard for me to keep track, but for some reason it works really well in here. And I think that's because all of the perspectives aren't important, they just serve a purpose. So there are a core few that are repeated. Obviously, like Adrian Schwartz, their stories are important, their perspectives are important, their wives' perspectives are important, but there's a lot of other intermingled perspectives that are just there to give you a different side of the story and to make this a little more epic. I mean, it goes as far as giving you like animals' perspectives of something, a situation, and it's kind of fun because you as the reader gets to see like the background and what's happening and what's to come for this kingdom and for these emperors when they don't really know. But at the same time, by the end of this book, you're left hanging because the 9-book series thing is kind of important. The second book in the series follows this timeline, but from a different perspective and like a different region. So you're left hanging at the end of this book. And obviously, like the 3rd book, you're probably going to get the answers that you need, I hope. But the second book follows a completely different character, and you don't know what's going on with them, and it doesn't really matter because it's a parallel timeline to this one. But this was just wild. It was great writing. I loved the characters. I say that I love them, but in reality, you love to hate them. Like, you're not necessarily rooting for them, and you don't necessarily think they're the best characters. They're probably not going to be your new favorite characters, but like they're interesting and they're complex, and like there's a lot happening with them that makes you invested in their stories. I especially love the wives, and there's actually a polyamorous relationship in here that's truly polyamorous, and it's actually a really beautiful relationship that I was rooting for and invested in. But like, it's kind of funny because there isn't really many characters in here that I'm like super attached to, in the sense that like they're my new favorite characters of all time. I would die for them, but they're super complex, and so I got very invested in their stories and what was going to happen to them. So I'm nervous for the third book. And honestly, the end of this book, it took me out. This next book probably won't come as a surprise. It's a book that I recently read, and it destroyed me. I was sobbing. I was a mess, and I was stupid enough to listen to this at work. Like, the last quarter of this book, I listened to it at work, and I was crying on my lunch break. And that's The Sword of Kaigen. So I buddy read this with one of my best friends, Yasmin, and she also was fucked up by this book, which really made me feel, you know, good, because we both suffered. So Sword of Kaigen follows the Matsuda family, which is one of the most powerful families in the Kaiganese Empire. They're known for being able to wield this sword of ice. It's supposed to be one of the most powerful weapons that you could use, and Kaigen is mainly full of warriors. And so the two perspectives that you're getting is Masaki, and Masaki has married into the Matsuda family, so her husband is known as one of the most powerful warriors, and you follow her son, Mamoru, and he is the oldest son, so he is expected to follow in his father's footsteps. So you find out that Mamoru has made a friend, and this friend has taught him that maybe some of the history and the beliefs that the Kaiganese Empire has taught them for his entire life might just be propaganda. So Mamoru is kind of going through an identity crisis. And then you have Masaki, who used to be in her youth a really powerful warrior, but as soon as she married into the Matsuda family, she had to give up this title because in the Kaiganese Empire, women are basically just mothers. They're there to get married and have children. But in the background, there is a war brewing, and when it comes to their shores, you start to see these characters have to make really difficult decisions that they didn't really think that they would be faced with. The thing is, when I describe the book to you that way, I feel like you will go into this with the wrong expectations, because this really is like a character study. This is about the characters and the choices that they make, and like how war impacts people and societies, and the choices we make after war, and like what war does to families and people mentally, physically, emotionally. So I think it's really easy to go into this book expecting this epic battle after battle after battle, and there is fighting in here, there's a lot of fighting in here, but this really is about the characters. So I feel like if you don't feel any attachment to these characters, this book probably won't be as amazing as it was. But like I said earlier with We Hunt the Flame, I am very much into characters, and I was so attached to these characters from the very beginning. This book immediately sucked me in, and I will admit, as much as I love reading fantasy, I don't always get sucked into fantasies as quickly as I got sucked into this book. And like I said, I sobbed a lot. It ruined my life. But by the end of it, I couldn't stop thinking about these characters. Like, I had to take a break from reading for like a week, because I knew I wasn't going to read anything that was like this. And I was like searching the internet for something that was like this. And I mean, I've read most of what people suggested already, but also I felt like maybe I should just reread this. It's just a really beautiful book. I loved the writing. I liked the fight scenes. I felt really invested in all of the characters except for one character. I wasn't like super invested in them, but I liked seeing their story arc. And I think I read somewhere that somebody said this felt like some of the best character arcs they've ever seen, and I agree with that. Like, these have some of the best character arcs and what I felt like were realistic character arcs. I also just think that if a book has me on the floor sobbing, snotting, throwing up, questioning my life, it's gonna be one of the best books that I've read in the year, and it was, and I highly recommend. Okay, so now we're getting into my top 3 reads of the year. These are the ones that I consider to be actually in order of how much I enjoyed them. So the first one is The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina. I loved this. You can see by the tabs. The writing, stunning. But really what this did for me was it made me feel like coming home. It is a beautiful and magical story. I loved the writing in here. I loved the characters. They felt so real to me. And I liked the conversation of the things that we inherit and how, you know, sometimes our parents or our parents' parents have the best of intentions and it doesn't always go the way they planned, I guess. We don't always inherit the best of what our family wants for us. So to give a brief synopsis, this follows the Montoya family, and their grandmother, Orquídea, has asked them to gather at her house because she is going to die and she wants to distribute their inheritance to them. And so they all gather at this house, find that Orquídea has been turned into a tree, and they're kind of trying to unravel what has happened and all of the secrets that Orquídea has held close to her for so many years. So the story actually goes back and forth between the past, Orquídea's past, and the present, where you're following the Montoya family, but specifically 3 cousins who are kind of around the same age and are more accepting and open to Orquídea's inheritance. Like I said, the thing about this book for me was that it felt like coming home. The aspect of family just made me feel like I was wrapped up in a warm blanket, and I just felt so close to the entire family, and I loved the discussions of family. I loved the idea of family in here and inheritance. Like I said earlier, the aspect of what our family and generations of our family passed down to us was such an interesting conversation. But genuinely, the writing in here was just beautiful. It was so beautiful. Like, all of these tabs in here are me like highlighting things and making notes, and the tabs mean something. So the pink tabs are world building and the orange tabs are things that just really stuck out to me that I felt were beautiful, whether they were beautiful lines or just beautiful moments between characters. And that's really what makes this book so special to me, is that not only did it feel like coming home, but I was really attached to all of the characters. I especially loved the cousins, and I really enjoyed going into Orquídea's past and learning about her and her family in Ecuador and how she got to this point of turning into a tree and building her family, and why she held her secrets so close. I think, like I said yesterday, a lot of these books on this list have turned into comfort reads of sorts, and this one especially is a comfort read, I feel. I can see myself reading this, especially in like September, October for some reason. Mainly because I read this in September and I just felt like it was the perfect time to read it. Just the vibes of it fit really well with September and October, so I'm definitely going to be rereading this a lot. So my second favorite book of the year is actually one that surprised me, mainly because I had never read anything from this author before. And I have been slowly getting into horror recently, like in the last 2 years, I guess now. And this just like hit the mark for what I like in horror, but also it just stuck with me. This book, I think about it all the time, and that's Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. It was really odd to see the discussions about Rivers Solomon's book being on the best fantasy in the Goodreads Choice Awards, because this isn't a fantasy. This is very much like a horror, speculative fiction, body horror type book. And this has a lot of the things that I've learned that I love in horror, which is body horror, a culty vibe, and just like some speculative aspect to it. So this follows our main character Vern, and Vern is in what you could call as a cult. So Vern, at 7 months pregnant, leaves this like religious cult slash compound that she was living on and goes and has her children in the woods. And she's hiding from basically the pastor on this compound, who also happens to be her husband and whose children she's pregnant with. As she's raising her children, she kind of starts to go through this metamorphosis that's very unexplainable, and she starts to try to figure that out. And it leads on this wild adventure, and it's weird and it's creepy. I really do want to reread this because I, again, think that this is a book that benefits from a reread because it's such a weird book, but it's so good. In the blurb of this on the flap, it actually calls this a work of gothic fiction, and I do agree with that. The more that I've read gothic horror this year, the more I've realized that I do like that slow build into something really creepy, and when the overall tone of the book is really eerie, but you don't exactly know what's going on, but you're kind of on edge the whole time. That's how this book makes you feel. But also, it's like speculating on this religious cult that Vern was in, and like why she was chosen to be the pastor's wife, and why this religious compound exists in the first place, and like, was it really accomplishing what they set out to do? But then there's this weird metamorphosis thing happening that's really unexplainable, and she meets a lot of characters along the way that are just like interesting. And I loved the kids in here. I don't know that I love or hate kids in books. I don't know that I've read a lot of books with kids in them, but I really liked the kids in this book. They're pretty funny. But yeah, this is just a book that I think about a lot, and I think it was really smart. The writing was fantastic, and I'm just really excited to now read, I think it's called Ghost, which is the other, or no, it's called An Unkindness of Ghost, which is River Solomon's other book. I'm not sure if it was Faye's first novel, like Faye's debut novel, but it's one of the first. And I really have nothing to compare this to, so I couldn't say like, if you like this, you might like this. But I suppose if you were interested in certain aspects in Lakewood, that you might really enjoy some of the conversations in here. Okay, my number one book, it's a series. I don't think anybody's gonna be surprised by this. If you are, hello, I'm Steph, welcome to my channel. It's the whole trilogy. I'm not gonna pick one. I'm not gonna pick one. I still am shocked by the fact that I read this all this year. I picked the first one up in January for a video concept that I did, and my life went downhill from there because I became utterly obsessed with this series. I feel like at this point, since the last book has been released, a lot of people have been talking about Jade City, so most people know what this is about. So a brief synopsis: Jade City is an urban fantasy set in the city of K-Con, and in the city of K-Con, Jade is a very important and valuable resource. And you are following a family of greenbone warriors who can wield the power of Jade. So this family is the Call family. They are part of the No Peak clan. They function as the law in a lot of cases, but there is a rival clan who is basically as powerful as them, called the Mountain Clan. And so the city of K-Con is sort of divided between the Mountain and the No Peak clan. And essentially you're following the Call family as they have divides within this community. There's a drug on the rise, but also there's a lot of like family drama. And I love each and every one of these characters. I don't really know what more I can say about this series that I haven't already said, other than it broke me in many ways. I think about it daily. I'm very attached to these characters. I love every single one of these characters. Even though I had like a little troubled start with Hilo, by the end, I loved him. I really did, and that's saying a lot. That's saying quite a lot. I just find that this series is perfect for me. It works in every single way that I want it to because it's very character driven, but it's also fairly fast paced. But also it slowly starts to pull you out from focusing on this family to like, there's still a focus on this family, but you're starting to get to know all of the politics, and there's just a perfect interweaving of politics and drama and fight scenes, and like there's no concrete magic system, so you don't have to like spend all this time focusing on a magic system. You get to focus on the characters and the politics are really interesting, and especially when you take into consideration how jade is used in this book and how it starts to transform through years. And this is a saga. It says the Greenbone Saga. This is a saga. This series takes place over generations. Well, I mean, it's not two full generations, but you are following your 4 siblings, and then you follow their children in the last book technically, but like this just does so much, and it does it so well, and the writing is amazing. Characters, amazing. This series, flawless. This is the best ending to a series. I've never cried so much. And I've said that I've cried a lot in this video, and that's why these are favorites. It's one of the only series that, like, if you tell me you don't like it, just don't. I can handle you telling me you don't like any other series, but not this one. Okay, so those are my favorite books of 2021. I'm gonna wrap this up quickly because I don't think my camera is gonna make it. Please let me know down below some of your favorite books of the year. If you agree with me on any of these books, let me know. I would love to chat about the books with you down below, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!